This is Thursday, May 14th, 2020, and I'm doing comments on a book called Religion Explained by Pascal. It's the evolutionary origins of religious thought. And like any good book, this is a journey that starts sort of simply, but then gets more and more complicated. And we are in chapter 3, or I am in chapter 3, and what seems kind of simple and straightforward turns out to be quite elaborate and complex. As a good teacher, he has begun by talking about templates and concepts, making it very simple, saying that a particular species, for instance, of animal is the template, and the animal itself is the concept. He moves on in chapter 2 to a much more, what he calls jargon, a nuanced understanding of inferences and default inferences and what he calls ontological categories and expectations. Expectations are those things that when you figure out the category, it comes with expectations. Well, those are nice sort of general descriptions, but in chapter 3 he gets down to the nitty-gritty, and he begins to talk about it in terms of much more complex things. He uses an analogy to begin with, which is from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle are visiting Pemberley, which is Mr. Darcy's estate, which is quite a grand thing. And Boyer points out that there's, like any great estate, there's an upstairs and a downstairs. We know this from Downton Abbey and from upstairs, downstairs. If you've ever seen those, you will know what I'm talking about. Anyway, he says a great estate is run by a whole lot of fairly invisible servants, and those servants are highly specialized, and they don't really, in smaller estates, somebody might do 2 or 3 different functions, but in a great estate, you have enough to do with your specialized function. So you might be a lady's maid, or you might be a butler, or a housekeeper, or the chef, or the well, you name it. There are all these little specialties, and he's making the analogy with the way the human brain works. The human brain has what he's introduced a number of times in a number of different ways, inference systems. But in this particular thing, he's making those inference systems quite much more specific. He tells us a story about a man who is crossing the lawn and coming out of the back of a house, and there's a little child with a dog on a leash. The dog sees a cat, and the dog runs toward the cat, and the little child can't hold the leash, so gets away and brushes or collides with the old man, and the old man trips and falls down. His hat falls off, and he gets up and keeps moving away. There happens to be a policeman watching, and a policewoman actually, and she grabs the hat and tries to follow him to catch up with him to give him his hat, and as she touches his shoulder, he misunderstands that she is not there to arrest him. She is there to give him his hat. So he pulls his pockets out, and he's got jewels and rings that he has stolen from the house that he was in. Okay, so all of these, there are a bunch of different things that, a bunch of different inference systems that are triggered by this story. For instance, understanding the physics of solid objects. When the dog collides with the man, that's solid object with solid object. So that's a kind of intuitive physics there. Understanding physical causation. The interesting thing about causation is it's invisible. But we see that the dog causes the man to trip. And so we have an inference system that figures out, or that sort of infers that he is knocked over by this dog. Then there's a detecting of goal directed. We see the dog moving toward the cat. We assume the goal is to get to the cat. Now, any stupid dog that goes after a cat will get its nose scratched well, but nevertheless, it is a goal-oriented understanding, inference that we make automatically without even thinking about it. And we, in the story, we keep track of who is who. If we were in the story itself, we would keep track with our visual apparatus, facial identification. It's been interesting to me as a photographer that facial identification is one of the first major systems that was added to digital photography. Most of the, actually, much of the first digital cameras were already mimicking what had been done at the height of the film, but then things began to get added to it, and visual facial recognition is one of those things. Linking structure to function. Okay, there's a screwdriver that I didn't mention, and the screwdriver we know has a particular function. We know it's long and narrow and sharp, and we know that the head of the screwdriver fits into the head of the screw to drive the screw into whatever it goes into. And finally, the understanding of mental representation, another inference system. Each of these specialized systems only handles a limited aspect of the information available about our surroundings, but produces very smart inferences about that aspect. Now, then he talks about the various kinds of what he calls intuitive physics. We have a rather sophisticated inference system when it comes to solid objects and inanimate objects and so forth. We have very precise expectations, and it's something that we're not aware of. It's below our consciousness, but it is nevertheless there. Intuitive physics has observable phenomenon, comes from observable phenomenon like the motion of objects to infer what is intrinsically invisible. Now, if you've taken physics, you know that much of that can be calculated mathematically, but our inference system has been doing this for a long time without the mathematical precision. We know, for instance, looking at billiard balls hitting each other, that one will hit another and it'll go off at an angle depending on where it's hit on the ball. So that gives us a sense of causation and a sense of what solid objects do when they hit each other. The thing is, what we don't realize, of course, is when we're thinking about that, causation is invisible. Our inference system gives us a real sense of what the cause is, but it's something that, first of all, happens below the level of our awareness, but also it's just like the mental inference system tells us about what's going on in somebody else's head. That's invisible. We never see that, really. We just infer it. We can think of a game where there are a bunch of dots on a field, and one dot will hit another, and another will hit another, and so on and so forth until they are all in motion. The dots, relative motion, you can create the illusion of even social causation, everything bumping everything else. We, right now in the pandemic, we're going through this idea of contact tracing, which is a social causation kind of thing, the social causation of the virus, how it was passed around. Now, that's a real thing, but it's invisible. It happened before the tracer goes after to talk to the person who has been affected. In the same way as in a simpler experiment, the adult subjects know that what they see are in fact the dots on a screen. So they know it's the dots and screens, but they see them all bouncing around. And they cannot help but perceive them as engaged in a chase or in bouncing off each other. It's an illusion, of course, a symbolic illusion. The term theory may be misleading. He calls these things. We have the theory of mind. We have the theory of physics. We have the theory of, all of these are theories. But this is a term that he's going to discard, actually. The theory may be a bit misleading. So here is a more precise description. Seeing or otherwise perceiving an object activates a particular set of inference systems. In our brain, there are a bunch of systems that infer things, and all this data is coming in, and it triggers and different inference systems within our brain. And those inference systems not all objects activate all of them. In fact, a certain type of object activates a certain array of panoply, he says here, of inference systems, is what we mean when we say that it belongs to a particular category. And the categories he's talking about is an inference system for intuitive physics, a goal direction system, an intuitive psychology system, a structural function system. All of this is to show you can replace what I called ontological categories with theories and with a list of appropriate systems. And the reason for that is psychologists, for instance, talk about the theory of the mind, which is for Pascal Boyer would be an ontological category of the mind. So he's just trying to draw together all of the different experimental groups, and there are different groups doing things. There are actually 4 major places that we get information about the inference systems in our brain. The first is experimental studies with normal adults. These have elicited a number of principles that normal adults have. Causation is one of many examples of such principles, but there are a lot of other principles as well. The people who are working with cognitive development with children and young people, they have shown much more precision than before from some of these principles. In other words, they're looking at children, they realize that some of those things are missing, and those principles are missing, and they are added at some point in the developmental reality of a child. And so we have begun to have a picture of not only the principles that we see from adults, but the emergence of those principles in children and young people. We have, of course, the ability to look inside the brain, healthy brains, without hurting them. And that's called fMRI or MRI, which is magnetic or resonance imaging. It looks at the magnetic the magnetic experiences that are coming, so it can see when parts of the brain lights up, and so we're getting some idea of where these inference systems are, some parts of them. Anyway, and finally there's a 4th group called neuropsychologists, and they're working with cognitive pathologies. The first one he really talks about is autism, and that's autistic people have pretty much everything except perhaps a very good understanding of the representations of what goes on in somebody else's mind. That sort of theory of mind that psychologists would call it, that is missing in people with autism. So these 4 groups have begun to flesh out our understanding of inference systems. Now, he talks about a fish indicating that the categories the inference systems use can be different. So a fish flopping around is an animal, and the inference systems that lead us to understand it's an animal are there. If we were to pick up the fish and hit somebody with it, the inference system would be that of a tool. If we cooked the fish, then it would be the inference systems that of an artifact, because there it would be laying on its side, waiting for us to eat it. A description of our minds as a bundle of inference systems differently activated by different objects is better than that of a mental encyclopedia, because it is much closer to the way a brain actually organizes. So if you remember back to the great estate with all of the servants below stairs who were taking care of all the things that were more or less invisible to the upstairs folks, that basically there's no general catalog, but there's a whole bunch of systems that work separately, that turn on and turn off as needed. As the data comes into the brain, it is siphoned off into inference systems. there may not be a category of artifacts in the brain, but there is a system for finding out how to handle tool-like objects, which is far more specific. That's the interesting thing about these inference systems, is they're quite specific. In the fMRI or MRI, the parts of the brain that are fired off are really interesting. So one of the things that they noticed, for instance, and I'll just move over here to in our brains, if somebody makes a gesture to us, say waves to us, in the brain, the MRI will show that those areas that are the inference system for doing the gesture ourselves are triggered. Now, it doesn't trigger the motion of the arm. It just triggers the fact that it's recognized as a gesture that we ourselves could make in our own head. That's gesture copying. And much work has been done with infants on gestures, and that the gestures that we often interpret as random or chaotic or even spastic of an infant are not that at all. They are, in essence, trying to mimic the gestures that are there, and the parts of their brain that are triggered are the same parts if they make the gesture or if someone gestures to them. The infants develop that. Okay, to sum up, then, our internal descriptions of other people's mental life is not the product of a single general theory of persons, but the outcome of many different perceptions, simulations, and inferences about different aspects of what they experience. What seemed a unified domain of intuitive psychology is, in fact, a collection of subdomains of specialized systems. So, this idea of ontological categories, that's sort of an end product. That's looking at the end product of the whatever it is, whether it's a mental process or causation or whatever. That's the end product. What's going on in the brain itself is a whole lot of firing of different systems to get to that understanding. I was taken by, when I was in Vietnam, and before that, I was involved in scout dogs in the military, in the Army. So I had a scout dog platoon in Vietnam for 7 months, and the process by which a dog handler operates is to know the alert of the dog. And what happens when the whole purpose of a scout dog is to keep the point unit of a military movement, to keep it from walking into an ambush. And the idea is that the dog will smell the enemy and alert on that enemy. And what happens is it may smell, but then it tries to verify with other senses. So it perks its ears up, turns its head in the direction that the scent is coming from. That's an alert, and that is where the communication happens between the handler and the dog. So if the dog alerts, and you're in deep jungle, you're going to say to the person running the infantry element, wait, looks like we may be walking into something here. And that's the purpose of a scout dog, is to keep people from walking into ambushes, keep an alert. but understand that that alert in the dog is inference systems operating, and the watching the alert is the inference system of the handler operating as well, determining causation, if you will. One of the interesting things he says right at the end is the study of young children asks a more radical, the most radical philosophical questions. Where does knowledge come from, and how do we ever manage to discover anything about the world around us? That would be the philosophical branch of epistemology, to know, and it is the neuropsychologists who are looking at infants and children who are really doing that work. Well, you can see that we have gone from a fairly simple explanation of templates and concepts to a rather complicated system, but very precise system of inferential systems that do a whole variety of things. And it comes closer to understanding how the human mind works. Well, we have more to go through in the third chapter, so there must be more complexity to come. Anyway, you have a good day, and thank you for listening.